Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and you have probably guessed correct, dear listeners. The teacup is again cooking the books. That's what bookkeepers do. And she's also taking care of our newest addition to our company. New apprentices for our CEO. There's a lot of work to be done here at Book Lovers Companion, so he needs a little bit of support. So that's what she's taking care of. But here with me from across the bonds, author Gerry Wilson. Gerry, hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much, Edith. I'm thrilled to be here.
It's wonderful to have you on because your book was published only this year. Is that correct?
That's right, February of this year.
Mm-hmm. And before we started the recording, you said it's a special kind of novel. It takes place or is set in Mississippi in the year 1918. And what can you tell our listeners about this novel, about the characters, about the plot, without giving too much away, of course?
Sure. Well, the title of the novel is That Pinson Girl. That was not the title for a long time. That was a title that the press's editor and I came up with that we thought was more appropriate for it. But it is set during the World War I era, and it's set in North Mississippi in the Red Clay Hills. That's if your listeners and followers are familiar with William Faulkner's work, that's where Faulkner's novels are set. And it's also where I grew up, so I was drawn to that landscape for this novel. The novel's main character is a young woman named Leona Pinson, that girl. And she is like 16, 17, 18 years old over the course of the novel. Leona has only gone through the 8th grade. That's all the education that's available to her, living out in the country the way she does. She lives with her mother and her aunt, who happens to be a little person, and her brother out in the country from a little town called Sully, Mississippi. Leona's father has died a year or so before the opening of the novel. And so when Leona gets pregnant out of wedlock, she refuses to name the child's father. And that renders her an outcast, basically, in this little rural community. Her brother is very cruel. He is someone who is aligned with what we might call bands of raiders, similar to those that roamed the southern countryside after the Civil War. Her best ally is a biracial sharecropper named Luther Biggs, who has deep ties to the Pinson family. And so as the novel unfolds, Leona is in this position of being very much ostracized, at the mercy of her cruel brother. But somehow Leona has to find the courage to take care of herself and her son. And in the midst of all that, there are a number of secrets that the characters are keeping from each other. And as those secrets unfold and break down, then Leona has to rise to that occasion and save herself, basically.
Reading this book of yours, it felt, from my perspective, a little bit stifling, or the atmosphere felt stifling. Was it intended that way? I got the impression that Leona is more or less trapped in this community. It's about, you mentioned it, it's a rural community, it's ridden with poverty. We're not talking about very rich people. Her family is white, though they are not rich people. You have this community of Black people who are also, of course, not rich. So would you say that it is for her stifling also? Like you said, she has a son out of wedlock, which makes it, I suppose, even harder for her to live in this atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. She is very much trapped, I think, by her circumstances, and that was a difficulty in writing her character
Mm.
for me because, a passive character is not very interesting, but how to give agency to this teenage girl
Yeah.
living in that time and place, even without the pregnancy,
Yeah.
without that element, would have been hard, I think. And this is not plantation. This is
Uh-huh.
not Mississippi Delta plantation culture. You're absolutely right, Edith. These are sort of genteel poor, if I can use
Mhm.
that term. They are poor farmers.
Yeah.
Um, they get by, and that's about it. And so I think in that context, it creates an even greater rivalry and
Yeah.
enmity between black and white in
Mhm.
those days.
Mm. For the whites, I suppose, to make sure they are even still a step up from the blacks, although they are both not, like you said, not rich themselves.
Yeah, a little bit. The character of Pap, Huck Finn's father, comes to mind. There's a scene in Huckleberry Finn where um, Huck's dad is just irate when he finds out
Mm.
that black people can vote. And he's just incensed by that is somehow lifting black people above him or making them equal
Mm.
to him. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. And you mentioned so yourself that there are a lot of secrets in this family, in this community, especially the family of Leona and the people who live more or less with them, or let's say they work with them. You mentioned Luther and his family, and there is a lot for Leona to find out, which changes a lot her perspective of her family, her mother, her father, and how
Yeah.
the impact it had. We see the impact it has on her, but also on her brother.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I've been asked if it was hard to write Raymond, her brother, because he's such a villain. And it was hard, but it was also fun in a way, to play with this character who is villainous, but also to discover the part of him that's vulnerable.
Mm.
I think that's always important when you have a character with who comes across as evil or bad, to recognize that there is almost always a side to that person that has made him the way he is or her.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, especially to see that he's not all completely evil.
yeah,
That's
yeah. I hope
what.
that comes through.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
hope
it
that comes
does.
through.
Yeah, it does. And also
Yeah.
interesting character, although not main character, I'd say her mother, Rose, a distant mother
Mhm. Mhm.
who does a lot of Bible reading, who does a lot of praying, and yeah, Leona thinks she's a righteous woman. Turns out, yeah, but there is a incredible secret, and maybe that's the reason why she has to do a lot of praying.
And why she distances herself.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
Especially when she sees Leona's life take this turn.
yeah, having a
Yeah,
child out of wedlock at this
yeah,
time in this place,
yeah.
yeah, must have been hard. I mean, a question would also be, of course, regarding this book. Where did you find the idea for this book? Where did it come from?
Well, I think it comes from my own family history. Um, I grew up in a household I was an only child, but I lived with my parents and my maternal grandparents.
Mhm.
Um, and my grandparents were World War I era. My granddad had gone to France
Mhm.
in World
Mhm.
War I, came back, lost a lung to tuberculosis, became a semi-invalid for the
Mhm.
rest of his life, and died when I was 10. My grandmother was a great storyteller, and she was sort of the keeper of family stories. And so I heard stories all my life growing up. Um, and so I was drawn to this era, I think, because of the things that I knew about them. And I have a wonderful little artifact. It's a letter that's about, 3 by 5 inches, the little, very fragile envelope,
Mhm.
thin
Mhm.
paper,
Mhm.
written to my granddaddy by a woman in New York whom he met when the boys about to ship over had a few days in New York City.
Mhm.
And the letter was written on Armistice Day,
Mm.
and she describes the activity, what's happening in the streets of New York when the news breaks out that the war is over. And that letter followed him from New York all the way to France and all the way back to his little rural post office in North Mississippi. And
Mm.
it's covered in postal stamps, APO stamps. Um, and I had his dog tag. Um, she told stories about helping to nurse people through the influenza.
Mhm.
Um, she kept a garden, and she kept um, cows and chickens, and sold milk and eggs to the neighbors to try to get by. Um, so I think that's the thing that really drew me to this era. I
Mhm.
had written a couple of novels before this one,
Mhm.
but this is the first that really goes that far back in
Mhm.
history. And once I got into it, I loved working with
Mhm.
that historical time frame. It's just so rich to me.
Mhm. And how much research did you have to do to get it all right, to get the tone for this era right?
Well, I had to do a good bit. I think as far as the language of the novel is concerned, it's not terribly different from the language I grew up with.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and I wanted to be careful. I'm a believer in light-handed dialect.
Mhm.
I don't like dialect that's phonetically spelled and overdone, and
Mhm.
that's just personal preference. And so I wanted to be really careful with the way I represented the speech. Um, let's see, what else to say about that? Um, I lost my train of thought, Edith. Refresh me.
The research for this novel, for this era, to
Oh,
get the
oh,
tone right
yeah,
for your readers.
yeah. Um, yeah, I had to do a good bit. Um, I wanted to get the details of the war right.
Mhm.
I wanted to get the details of farm life right in
Mhm.
that era. There's a scene where um, they're slaughtering a hog,
Mhm.
and I had to try to figure out how to make that accurate.
Mhm.
Um, the young man who's the father of Leona's child is named Walker Broom, and I go into Walker's point of view
Mhm.
several times over the course of the book. One is when he's on the ship going over. Um, one is when he's on the battlefield, and that the battlefield scene I especially had to read
Yeah.
about what that was like. What was it like to
Yeah.
be in the
Yeah.
trenches
Yeah.
in France
Yeah.
in World War One? Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and I like supplying that kind of detail. I wanted it to be accurate, but I think the purpose of historical detail is to support the story
Mhm.
in an authentic way.
Yeah.
Um, there again, not to be heavy-handed. I don't ever want attention to the details themselves, so that the reader goes, "Oh, wait, here are these details. How does this fit into the story?"
Yeah, not too much, just enough.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And did you think of, or have you thought of, writing this different perspective in a first person narration?
I think I played around with that some,
Mhm,
with first and third. I generally do that,
mhm,
um, whether I'm working on novels or particularly writing short stories. I
mhm,
like to play with what that does to perspective,
mhm.
but also how it limits, because first person is limiting
Yeah,
in some ways,
yeah,
um, as far as, how much a character can know,
yeah, yeah,
perceive,
absolutely.
understand, reveal.
Yeah.
And that can be interesting and fun, and I've done that. I like writing in first person. But for this, for a long time, I tried to keep it in Leona's point of view only,
Mhm,
and the voices just nagged at me. I just felt that they needed to be there. I wanted those different perspectives. And I
mhm,
want to go back to the research for just a second too.
mhm,
Uh, the influenza was something that I was also drawn to. That was such a traumatic experience for so many people around the world,
yeah,
really, at least in the Western world.
yeah.
Um, there's a terrific book called The Great Influenza, and that was my primary source. It's the author's last name is Barry, Barry. Um, and so if anybody ever wants to learn more than you ever thought you wanted to know about the influenza epidemic, um, there is that. That's just excellent.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, well, COVID has nothing on it
Absolutely.
in a
I
way.
think, yeah, I started this book. May I go off topic just a little bit?
Of course, please do.
Okay. I started this book in about, oh, 2011, 2010, 2011, 12, somewhere along in there. Um, Finished it, tried to place it with a press,
Mhm.
put it aside for a long time. Every now and then I would pull it out and look at it, read through it. And I was just never happy with it particularly. And it was during COVID, in 2021. I know exactly when it was, the
Mhm.
summer of 2021, when things were just really dragging on with COVID. I was drawn back to this story.
Yeah.
Um, I think partly because of the impact of COVID.
Mhm.
Um, and so it was like seeing it anew. And I wish that would happen with everything I write, that I could set it aside for a while and come back to it and have this eureka moment. And of course, that doesn't always happen. But it sort of happened with this book, and I changed a number of things about it. Was able to open some doors that I hadn't been able to open before.
Oh.
And I really think it was that. And also, COVID gave me a sense of that isolation
Mhm.
that I think that I needed to be able to portray
Mhm.
in this
Mhm.
novel.
I mean, also writing about this rural community, it's also hard to get the medical help there, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Women would have given birth at home, even in small towns.
Yeah.
There was no hospital
Yeah.
in this little town
Yeah.
near where they lived.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the support from each other, I suppose, was the most important thing, wasn't there? Also between black and whites, because that's something that Leona mentions, or it is mentioned in the book that Luther's wife, she was a midwife.
Yeah. Yes. There was an interconnectedness, regardless of race, and I think that's important, I think, to the novel, is the reliance on each other and the care for each other in spite of,
Oh.
the kinds of discrimination. Leona we would call Leona a racist. Um, But it's what, and I'm not defending that, it's what she knew. It's what she had grown up with. There's a moment when she thinks about the fact that she loves Luther almost like a father.
Yeah.
And she's taken aback by that thought. She thinks, oh, that's inappropriate. I can't do that. I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't feel affection for this Black man. And so, I hope the historical aspects of all that somehow play with the issues that we still confront. I think the best historical fiction has to do that. It has to be relevant somehow to the world we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Understand the past or learn about the past to understand the present, isn't it?
Yeah.
We can't ignore it. We can't make it go away. And we certainly are not able to change the past.
Even though there are attempts to do that.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
But it is not to be done. I mean, let's be honest. And you can't just scratch things from the history books, because otherwise, how are you supposed to learn then from past mistakes?
Yeah.
I mean, look at the past and learn from it, not just make it go away. You can't make it go away, but you can put your head in the sand like an ostrich and pretend it never happened. But what will happen then?
Make the same mistakes
again. Yeah, over and over again. Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Which we have human beings to do anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of looking at those different communities, the Black community, white community, this interconnection between them, but also this role of the women. You said so. You had to support each other. You had to help each other. But in the end, it is always the men that made the decisions, and what they decided had an even greater impact on the women, be that Black or white. Wasn't it? Especially back then.
Yeah. Yeah. The men were totally in charge.
Yeah, I mean, best example, Leona's brother Raymond. I mean, she had to keep up the farm. She had to make sure everything is going, and yet what he does? Being angry all the time. Being the one his mother, loved. Or it felt to Leona, loved more than she loved her daughter.
Yeah. Dotes is a good old word for that. She dotes on Raymond clearly.
Because he's a boy, or because he was the firstborn?
Possibly both. Probably both. Yeah. But it was a male-oriented society, for sure.
Yeah.
And even had Leona not had the child, her prospects were not very good. Her best prospect was to marry a local farm boy and continue the kind of life that she's lived already.
So not much chance for someone like Leona for an education to escape from this community back then?
No, not much chance of that. I mean, one of the options that they might have considered when she discovered she was pregnant would be to send her away to live with a distant relative, or to send her to a home for unwed mothers, that kind of thing. And they had no place to send her. They had no relative far away to take her in, and they couldn't afford the other option. Yeah, so her options were very limited.
And what role did religion play in these communities? Because there's only a short mention in your book about the pastor and how her being pregnant out of wedlock was received by the larger community.
Mhm. Mhm. Religion was oppressive. Um, the local preacher wants Rose, Leona's mother, to bring her to the church and make her confess publicly
Mm.
what she's done and name the father of the child. So the pressure is not just on Leona, it's on the rest of her family too.
Oh.
Um, Rose's, you mentioned Rose's preoccupation with reading her Bible and praying. I'm not even sure what role that plays in Rose's life. It's interesting to think about that.
Mm.
Um, whether it's genuine because of her inner turmoil and
Yeah.
she's really seeking some kind of solace for
Mm.
herself.
Maybe also atonement for past sins.
Atonement. I like to think of it that way, that it's not just a device for her,
Yeah.
a way of retreating from her real responsibilities in the world. Maybe it's both.
Mm.
Maybe it's both those things.
Mhm. Mm. I mean, compared to now, how would you say has that changed this, or has it changed at all, this role religion plays in small communities nowadays in this part of the United States?
Oh, I think religion plays a huge role in rural communities. Um, I can only, speak for my own place, but I know that's true here. Whether that's true in other places so much, but I have a
Mm.
feeling that it may be still very important.
Mm.
I mean, it's important to me. My faith is important to me.
Mhm.
Um, and to project that into this historical time frame, I mean, obviously I used it.
Mhm.
It was a device to help
Mhm. Mhm.
develop the character of the mother, and
Mhm.
also to help develop Leona's independence,
Mhm.
because Leona wants no part of it,
Mm.
especially when the church is so condemning of her.
Mhm. Mm. Yeah, true. There's one character we haven't spoken about, and he doesn't feature as a character, a living character in your book, but he's always there. It is Leona's father.
Yeah.
He's always there,
Mm.
he's always mentioned, he plays a major part in the story, although he's already dead when this when your novel is set. What can you tell our listeners about Leona's father?
Leona's father is Herbert, and Herbert has been killed in a hunting accident. I'll put that in quotes. Because the family doesn't really, the family believes that maybe it was not an accident, that maybe he was murdered. There's a dispute over some land that Herbert was involved in. And so there's that little element of mystery, but Herbert is a presence. Um, Luther and Herbert um, had been great friends in the past. Um, and there's a secret that involves both of them that I don't want to delve into
No, we
here.
do not want to give that away.
We don't want to spoil her. We don't want to spoil it. No. But suffice it to say that they had been very close as younger men. Um, and Herbert is still a kind of haunting presence for Luther. And Luther also feels an obligation to Herbert to look after the farm, and particularly after Leona, and particularly because of Raymond's behavior toward Leona,
Oh.
his endangerment of her. Um, so Herbert smoked a pipe, and sometimes there is this um, essence of the smell of pipe tobacco. Um, Herbert appears to Luther in moments of crisis. So yeah, in one version of the novel, I started the book with a prologue that was about Herbert's death. And someone in a workshop early on, a writing workshop, told me to lose that. That I
Why?
was giving away that I
Oh.
was giving away too much. And I think this author was sort of opposed to prologues in general,
Mm.
as a setup. And I sort of like that idea as a setup because even though it was not a major plot thread,
Mhm.
it was essential.
Mhm.
The father's absence is essential
Mhm.
to the story.
And was there a thought to bring it back in a later part of the book? Or have you thought about that?
To bring Herbert back,
No, no, this prologue, change it from a prologue to a, I don't know, flashback sort of thing.
that's what it became.
Yeah,
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 that's what it became.
yeah. It's always
Yeah.
interesting to have these sorts of, in between information to learn more about the whole story. So, thinking about it as
Yeah, and and
once
and
I've
and how much to reveal and when is a huge question
yeah,
with
yeah,
a novel.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And are you this kind of writer that plans meticulously? Or do no? Okay, not at
She
all.
shakes her head. No,
Well,
no. I wish I were better at that. I mean, obviously, you have to do some, or I have to do some planning, and I have to. Um, I did. I thought I knew the ending all
mhm,
along, and I
mhm,
like to have a sense of where I'm going to wind up. Um, I think that helps me get there,
mhm,
but I don't outline,
mhm,
unless you count maybe, um, taking Post-it notes and, assigning different colors to different characters and looking at how the thread for each character is evolving over the course of the book and where maybe I discover that I have a gap,
mhm,
that I need Raymond's presence
mhm,
here
mhm.
somehow. I do that kind of thing, but no, I don't outline. I wish I could. I just and there's nothing, y you know, a sort of woo-woo kind of feel to it. It's not that I'm waiting for the story to descend from above somehow. Um, Although it's really nice if that happens. And I have had, insights into stories that came totally unexpected.
Hmm,
Um, I was in a workshop once with Andre Dubus, whose work I just really love. Andre Dubus III, his father,
mhm,
was also an excellent writer.
mhm,
And he called it opening doors. He said, look for the places where you need to open a door and go deeper or go wider.
mhm,
And that you have the luxury of doing that in a novel that you don't have in a short story.
mhm,
So that's always stuck with me. And when I revise, the novel I'm revising right now, I sort of had that experience the other day. I've been reading back through it and just sort of making minor changes as I go and making note of things that I need to pay
mhm,
closer attention to. And it occurred to me that there was not enough interior work for the main character. Um, that it's a historical novel set during the late '60s, during the Vietnam War,
mhm,
and and the young woman at the heart of it was not missing her husband, who's gone to Vietnam, was not wondering about his safety, wondering where he is, um, not nothing going deeper about how she was coping or what.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just things like that, insights like that are really important. And so that's a door I need to go back and
Mm-hmm.
open
Mm-hmm.
with that character.
And do these doors open for you also during the writing process? Because you said
Yeah.
briefly that characters more or less looked over your shoulder and told you, told you,
I
I
wish
need, I
wish
need,
that were true. Yeah.
I need more space. You need to tell my story a
Yeah.
bit in depth.
Yeah. 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 And it's a, call it instinct,
Yeah,
intuition, or even practice, I
yeah,
think, after you've been doing this a while,
yeah.
you learn more
Mm,
about, how to do the things that you need to do to
yeah,
deepen a story, enhance a story, make it work,
yeah,
because ultimately that's what you want it to do. You want it to hang together, and
yeah,
you want it to work well for the
yeah,
reader.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. What is it for you that's so interesting about history or the past, particularly? You said your family's past and your grandmother's narrations. Now you are writing or setting a book in the 60s. What is it about history for yourself that makes it so fascinating to take a closer look at 1918 or the 60s?
Well, I lived the 60s.
Good point. Yep.
Good point. Yeah. And if there's a problem with this book that I'm working on now, it is that it is too autobiographical.
Ah,
Something I'm gonna have to address. Um, and I have another novel draft that's contemporary, um,
okay.
that was written before that Pinson Girl.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something about, maybe it's the distance,
Mm-hmm.
Edith.
Mm-hmm.
The distance allows, me at least, and maybe other writers of historical fiction, it allows us to, there will always be something of me, I think, in the stories I tell.
Mm-hmm.
There will always be those, my experiences, um, my mindset will
Mm-hmm.
be there in some
Mm-hmm.
way. Um, but what I do like about it is that it allows me to step away and not be so concerned about, is this too close? Is this too close to real life?
Mm-hmm.
And plus, it's just interesting. Um, I find the research interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, although I try to keep from, going down too many rabbit holes
Yeah.
with research, because it can be just all consuming.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah. And I really, that's something nobody has asked me to this point, but I think that's a really great question. And that thought of distance is the first thing that came to mind.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you said you lived the 60s, of course. That's an important part why you write it. Do you think, or are you afraid that you might remember things wrong about that period?
Hmm. That's an interesting question too. Um, it is fiction after all.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not writing memoir. I think
Yeah,
it's different. It's very different when you're writing memoir.
absolutely true. But you
Yeah.
often have this. You often have this. These readers who then read the book and say, "Oh, dear author, that's not how it was," and
Yeah.
so on.
Well, yeah, and I think for any author, um, writing about a period of time in her own life, it's going to be colored by her own experiences,
Oh,
and we don't experience a time frame. Excuse me, we don't experience a time frame in the same way. My life was very different from other people's lives in the
yeah.
60s. I grew up in a little town in North Mississippi. I think that's one of the things that informs Leona. for me is that I grew up very sheltered, not with a heavy hand, but very sheltered. Um, I cringe now at my lack of awareness of all the things that were going on in the civil rights movement. I was very young. I was getting married. I was having my first children, and I was aware, but I was not particularly engaged. So that was my experience, but that may not be somebody else's experience.
Yes,
Does
and
that make sense?
yeah, absolutely. And you can't be faulted for that. I mean, it is your experience, your personal experience, like you said, different from somebody else's. So indeed, I mean, you can make the same argument and say, yeah, because you in Europe, yeah, exactly. We do not share this kind of experience, this kind of experienced past that you share, for example, or you have in the United States.
Right.
Come to think of slavery and so on, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a hard question. I think it would be really it's not impossible for an author to create a character that's totally different. That's not to say that we can't create characters who are totally different from who we are.
Yeah.
I think the difficulty arises, and that's true for me right now, working back through this novel set when it is in the 60s, height of the civil rights movement. The difficulty is in finding a balance with the character between who I was and who I want this character to be.
Yeah.
I think it's more important is what I want her to be, not what I was and what I knew, what I understood. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned a little bit about the workshops that helped you develop your skills. And how important do you think is it for a writer to have this kind of community to develop the skill?
I think it's really important. And I think every writer needs a community. And of course, we're so fortunate now because we can do things like that online. When I first started writing fiction, that was not possible. But I was teaching high school English, and this was back in the early 90s, I guess. And I was really dismayed over how the kids were being taught to write, because they were being taught to write very rigid essays, like five paragraphs, and it has to be this way. You have to have an opening paragraph that states your thesis. Then you have 3 developing paragraphs, and then you have a closing paragraph that restates your thesis. And it just drove me crazy. And I was teaching like 10th and 11th graders. And the woman, who was a wonderful teacher, not to disparage her, and really it was foundational to their learning to write in more ways than that. But they would come to me with this rigid idea of how to write. And it just drove me nuts. And so I started doing some more creative things. I remember the first thing I did was around Halloween one year. I had them write ghost stories just for fun.
Yeah.
And they loved it. They loved it. And so ultimately I pitched creative writing classes to my school's administration, and they let me have a creative writing class. And then I sort of woke up and said, whoa, now I'm supposed to teach these kids to write, how do I go about that? And so part of my workshop experience began with that.
Mhm.
I remember doing a creative writing for teachers workshop at Bard College in upstate New York. Um, that was just eye-opening for me. It was just life-changing in
Mhm.
terms of my perspective
Mhm.
on my
Mhm.
own writing, and I wrote my first short story in that workshop.
Mhm.
And so, there was no MFA in my future. I have a grandson who's discovered that he loves to write fiction, and he's thinking about an MFA. And, I didn't have that. I
Yeah.
didn't have that option 40 years ago, 50 years ago.
I'm not sure
Um,
if we have that option at university level here in Austria.
yeah,
I don't think
yeah,
we do.
and that's wonderful. It's great that that younger people have that opportunity.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I had to sort of rely on people to read my work and give me feedback, and I did some great workshops
Mhm.
um, that were not always easy
Yeah,
because the feedback you get is not always what you want to hear,
true.
but you have to learn from it.
Yeah, maybe not what you want to hear, but maybe what you need to hear.
Maybe what you need to hear. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
And you said creative writing, it's a wonderful thing that you can hone your skills this way. How important is reading for a writer?
Oh, it's very important. Yeah, it's very important. And I still read a lot, as much as I can. Um, I mean, I've seen young writers go through phases where they mimic what they're reading,
Mm.
in their writing style, and that's not a bad thing, really.
Mhm.
You have to get beyond that, but if you are drawn to the rhythm of somebody's sentences, then, um, that's okay.
Mhm.
See if you can do that and then move
Mm.
beyond it.
Mm. Do you think that it might be hard for them to move beyond that? Do they need help to move beyond that? Like you said,
Probably.
those who give the feedback, not what they want to hear, but what they need to hear then?
Yeah, yeah. It can be hard. Um,
Yeah.
but also I always, um I used to tell my students, and I also taught, um, writing workshops too. I led workshops, for adults, um, in an adult enrichment education program at a local
Mhm.
college here in Jackson, where I live.
Mhm.
Um, and I think, you always have to remember um, that you own the work. The words are yours, and it's
Mhm.
important to listen to feedback. And my rule of thumb sort of is if more than one person tells me to take a hard look at something, then I better take a hard look at it. But ultimately, it's my decision, and I may not always do what the reader has suggested,
Mhm.
but it may lead me to find a different solution that
Mhm.
becomes my solution and not somebody else's.
Mhm. Mm.
Yeah.
Good advice, I'd say.
I hope so.
I
And
think
I have to
so.
tell myself that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to. Uh, Jerry, is there something out there in the world, genre-wise, as an author, you would so love to write about, but haven't dared yet?
I'd like to write a sequel to this book, to that
Oh,
Pinson Girl.
oh.
Um,
What is keeping you?
um, actually, one thing that has kept me has been I have been so busy
Hmm.
with, the marketing and planning book events, and, I have not been, I went through a sort of dry period with my own writing, which was sad, but I've heard other people say that it gets hard to juggle everything.
Yep.
And social media will just eat your time if you let it.
Yeah.
It really
Can
will.
imagine. Yeah.
And all of that has been fun. It's been necessary and fun. And I don't regret the effort I've put into, helping to promote this book. But I am trying now to regain I'm not a very disciplined person anyway when it comes to my writing, but I'm trying to regain a little bit of that maybe and get back to it.
Ah, okay. You keep your fingers crossed for you.
Yeah. Well, and I have a start on a sequel. But one of the things that's holding me back on that is that I wrote that before I rewrote That Pinson Girl 3 years ago.
Okay.
And so some of the things I'm doing in those 25 or 30,000 words, whatever it is, no longer work.
Okay.
And so it's gonna take more thought about,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
I said I don't plan ahead, but I've got to think that through and think about how a second book might tie in with That Pinson Girl, but also stand alone somehow. And that's the scary part about a sequel to me.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll see.
Well,
We shall see.
Yeah, we keep our fingers
Thank
crossed.
you. Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yes, absolutely. And is there anything you would never, ever write?
Science fiction. Fantasy.
Okay.
Just not my thing. Yeah.
Just as a writer, but also as a reader.
Yeah, I would say so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Okay. And may I ask you to elaborate a little bit on your future plans? What's coming next?
Edith, I'm 82 years old. I don't know what's coming next.
Oh,
I
come
pray.
on.
Yeah.
Oh, come on.
No.
That's no age.
No. No, I really, I went through a funk sort of after this book was published, thinking, oh, there's not another book in me. I don't have time for another book. And I've had to do a lot of self-talk about that. And I'm sort of coming out of that. I think just returning to, I'm also working on short stories. I'm close to having another short story collection ready to send out. It may never see the light of day. But I'm sort of coming around to that idea that, none of us are guaranteed tomorrow. And so why not? Why not revise another book? Why not work on the sequel? Why not explore something entirely new and different rather than projecting what may or may not be?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that. You make me think about that.
Yes, please do so.
I will. Thank you.
And Gerry, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
I don't know. I think you've done a beautiful job with your questions. I've really enjoyed your questions. I would say to readers, find your niche. Find the books that lift you up or make you think. Whatever that might be. Explore something new. I mean, I just said I'm not crazy about fantasy or science fiction, but I was a fan of the Hunger Games.
There you go.
I did read those books. There you go. So be open. Read, and be open to things you might not have thought you would ever pick up. And yeah.
Splendid. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Gerry,
thank you so much.
It was my absolute pleasure. I will join you shortly in the green room. Don't go away. I'll be with you in a minute again.
Thank you, Edith. Great opportunity.
Dear listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as my guest and I did. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and be there for our next episode.